The term globalization, in itself, calls for a great deal of unpacking. Whether used as a rhetoric device or an all-encompassing buzzword, people manage to conjure very different and subjective definitions. Manfred Steger offers a definition of globalization as a social process, an expansion and intensification of social relationships and consciousness across world-time and world-space. This definition is a great jumping off point to start narrowing the focus on what we really mean when we use the term globalization. Some have questioned and others have radically challenged a social framing of the word globalization. On the other hand, a political and economic framing too can obscure the cultural. The frame and the context in which the word is used clearly has great impact on the definition. The red line, as pointed out clearly by Steger, is this idea of intensified connectivity. Globality describes this connectivity in social, economic, and political terms, an ungrounded flow. Susan Christopherson points to how this broad connectivity can make country borders irrelevant and make location a non-factor. Emerging from this connection is the global imaginary, which purports to shift the view of the other. Arguably, this has linked humanity's causes and created a global consciousness. The backlash against proponents of this new world view, those pejoratively termed globalists, has been attributed to the rise of nationalism and xenophobia in Western democracies. Dan Sargent points to the argument made by nativists that political elites are prioritizing international stability over home country interests. This has managed to become a powerful narrative for nationalist political figures. Who benefits from this New World Order is widely disputed. Rebuking Thomas Friedman's notion that the world is flat, Susan Christopherson, Harry Garretson, and Ron Martin point out that wealth disparity is getting worse. They argue that even as barriers to access fall with the rise of connectivity, wealth continues to be accumulated and sustained by those who own capital. Development, then, can be quite uneven. Extreme concentrations of wealth in world's megacities contrasted by hundreds of millions of people living throughout the world on less than $2 a day. The economic picture does not look so flat. Through education, however, there is hope in harnessing this connectivity for more equity in the world and challenging the status quo. The hope is to establish a world where marginalized voices are heard, human dignity advanced, and equity rebalanced. Through the promotion of cosmopolitanism and the adherence to a capabilities approach, great change can become manifest both on the individual and global level. Built on the basis of both listening and teaching, cosmopolitanism hopes to make plurality and inclusion pillars of human interaction and identity. Scholar David Hansen writes that students deserve the opportunity to study local traditions and inheritances, both of their own culture and as a platform to engage larger world horizons of experience, knowledge, and point of view in order to more fully grasp the beauties, the distinctiveness, and the limitations in local horizons. Through cosmopolitanism, society can develop to become more empathetic and encourage mutual respect, greatly needed harmonizing forces for peace and unity on Earth. Architects and adherents to the capabilities approach, like Walker and Nussbaum, advocate for a liberal art style of education, where the objective is not only employment, but that of personal fulfillment and growth. Critical self-thinking, critical knowledge, and the action-oriented behavior are the ideal takeaways from social justice-oriented education. As Walker explains, the advancement of justice depends on inclusive democracy. Deepening democracy depends on discussion and collective reasoning that injects more information and knowledge, diverse perspectives, and plural voices into debates. Through the teaching of critical faculties, people can become more encouraged and engaged to add their voices to the debate. The intention of the capabilities approach is to enhance all members of society so as to enrich society as a whole. Humanity should be concerned with strengthening democratic systems, to engineer globalization, to follow principles that society has democratically agreed on. Ultimately, managing globalization will involve creating strong regulatory governance systems. Before we can get to that, we need to make sure discussions are being held with the inclusion of as many voices as possible and voices that are thinking critically. The Brookings Institute published a paper in 2017 entitled Millions Learning, which hopes to scale quality education in low and medium income countries, where millions may be going to school but not actually learning. It is seeking to provide a roadmap that would leapfrog over the estimated 100-year gap between developed and developing countries. The paper notes that in scaling quality education programs, it is crucial to understand who the programs are targeting, the different types of interventions, and having strong analysis of a program's effectiveness. From there, successful education programs can be built to cross borders and cultures. A good example of this practice is the expansion of Sesame Street. Now, in more than 150 countries, Sesame Street has been scaled because of its success in developing early cognitive development and learning in reading and math. Beyond scaling, Sesame Street is a good example of what has been termed glocalization, where a brand is both universal and local, merging cultures and attitudes for marketability. At looking at who these programs aim to affect, it is important to look at marginalized young people in poor countries. Let us consider Senegal, where many girls do not complete school because their families need them to work and help earn income. Once they leave the classroom, they rarely go back. For girls in parts of Senegal, the situation can be even worse. Offered as brides at the age of around 13 or 14, they are expected by their husbands to bear children and run a household, not to attend school. The average years of education for girls in Senegal is 9.2, compared to the US or France, which has an average of 16 and 17 respectively. In rural areas throughout Senegal, there is also a problem of high schools being located far from villages. Students need to find lodging in the major towns in order to even attend high schools. For young women, they are often forced to stay with distant relatives who may assign them the role of housekeeper and can be mistreated or suffer abuse by their hosts. How might the Senegalese government and NGOs work to address these issues? To first address the problem of adequate facilities, it could be said that supporting girls' boarding houses would be an effective way to ensure that they are able to study in a salubrious setting. This would ensure that girls from rural areas will not face the sort of abuse at the hands of a host. To reshape broader gender roles and encourage girls' empowerment, it is important in schools to foster discussion-based curriculum that addresses gender disparities. Borrowing from the pluralist and cosmopolitan philosophy, integrating critical thinking and reflection on deeply entrenched gender norms would help to build a more compassionate and understanding society and hopefully begin to change opinions about the role of women in society. The other question that needs to be considered is whether technology used in education can help teachers and students in developing countries, like Senegal. Leveraging computer and mobile technology can help spread ideas to distant rural locations, making learning more accessible and keep teachers on track. In my future studies and in the field of development, I'm aiming to understand how to harness tech and use it to improve the classroom experience and promote out-of-classroom learning, particularly on the subject of environmental conservation. There are many challenges with using information and communication technology, also known as ICT, in the developing world context. To avoid the pitfalls faced by many development projects that are designed in faraway office buildings, considering the local context is key. Working with what is available is always a best practice, and in rural Senegal, that means mobile phones. Rather than focusing on what new technology can be introduced and what could open doors, it is more compelling to focus on improved learning outcomes. Take the One Laptop Per Child initiative, which put millions of computers in the hands of world's poor. It's troubling when you see how in Uruguay, where 1 million of these computers were distributed, students' test scores did not improve. Many specialists in the field of education technology see technology as system strengthening rather than simply as material inputs. There's plenty potential for ICTs to improve reading and math levels. Research by the World Bank in 7 sub-Saharan African countries, for instance, has found that half of grade 4 students cannot read a simple word. Almost 3/4 cannot read all the words in a simple sentence. 12% cannot recognize numbers, 24% cannot add single digits, and 70% cannot subtract double digits. These statistics are alarming and bring to question whether teachers are properly equipped for their job or are even showing up to teach their students. Knowing that the environment in many places throughout sub-Saharan Africa is challenging, it is an oversimplified approach to blame absentee teachers. However, reinforcing teachers' ability to stay on track and get a deeper understanding of the material is certainly something that can be enhanced by ICTs. Having lesson plans preloaded on mobile devices is an example of how curriculum can be enhanced by integrating educational platforms with existing technologies. It also has the potential to build strong communities among teachers, share best practices, and gain important data from feedback. It would be ideal for governments to invest in training teachers and supporting them in rural posts. However, because many governments, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, are not responding to the needs of their people, NGO intervention is oftentimes essential to progress. Organizations that aim to work in education using local know-how and available resources while simultaneously harnessing the knowledge and powers of the 21st century are doing incredibly impactful and effective work around the world.